Hello and welcome to Faith in a Digital World, a production from TWR-UK. Pornography is now more accessible than ever, and with that accessibility comes a growing number of people who find themselves caught in patterns they never intended. Patterns that affect emotional well-being, relationships, and even their sense of identity and faith. And while the conversation around pornography is often reduced to shame, secrecy, or quick fixes, the reality is far more complex. Behind every struggle is a person, someone navigating loneliness, stress, trauma, curiosity, or simply the pressures of living in a hyper-connected world. These are deeply human experiences, and they deserve to be met with understanding rather than judgment. So, to help us explore this with wisdom and compassion, I'm joined today by Kat Etherington, Director of Recovery at the Naked Truth Project. Kat has spent years walking alongside individuals and communities impacted by compulsive sexual behaviours, helping them understand the roots of addiction and guiding them toward healing. Her work brings together psychology, lived experience, and a profound belief in the possibility of change. Today we'll talk about what pornography addiction costs us, emotionally, spiritually, and physically, and why those costs often remain hidden until someone feels stuck or completely overwhelmed. We'll look at how digital habits shape the brain, how secrecy and shame can isolate people from the support that they need, and how faith communities can respond in ways that are both truthful and deeply compassionate. But we'll also talk about hope, because recovery isn't just about stopping a behaviour, it's about rediscovering connection, rebuilding trust, and learning to live with greater integrity and freedom. In a digital age that constantly pulls our attention in 100 directions, Kat will help us to think about what genuine, sustainable recovery can look like and how we can support one another on that journey. So if this is a personal struggle for you, maybe it's affecting someone you love, or maybe it's just simply a topic that you want to understand better, please do stay with us. This is a conversation that I hope will really help. Kat Etherington from the Naked Truth Project, thank you so much for being with us on the programme today.
Hi James, I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
So first of all, just as we start to get to grips with this topic, from your work at the Naked Truth Project, what patterns are you seeing in how pornography use develops into addiction?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the first thing to say about that is that the whole landscape in terms of how people access pornography has really changed since the birth of the internet. Once upon a time, you had to wander down to the corner shop and go eyeball to eyeball with the lady behind the counter to get your pornographic content, or else you most likely inherited it from an older sibling or cousin or somebody in the family or at school. And of course, we know that when internet pornography really started to become more mainstream, that totally changed that whole dynamic of even how people were accessing pornography. And with that came an increase in the number of people who were seeing it accidentally, in an unwanted way, or were maybe, putting in a innocent Google search and things were put in front of them that they weren't expecting. And so I would say the first thing that changed in terms of patterns is how many more people were able to access pornography in an unprotected and often unregulated way. And so we didn't see the same kind of developmental process unfolding where maybe you would see that normal childhood curiosity looking at something and that wouldn't necessarily go anywhere. Just the unlimited and unregulated accessibility has really meant that the landscape changed quite dramatically from that time. And inevitably, with that change and that accessibility came more people escalating more quickly through the process of kind of becoming desensitized to what they were looking at and needing different types of pornography or different genres and things like that. And so we just have seen an explosion in people reporting addiction or problematic or compulsive pornography use in the last probably 10 to 15 years particularly, but that has its roots in that early kind of internet generation.
Can I just pick up on that in a little bit more detail then? Because there are many people in our society who would argue that actually pornography can just be a bit of harmless fun, that you can use it, you can get what you need from it, and then move on and get on with your day. But you're seeing people who have developed an addiction to it. And I've heard you argue before as well that if you do start engaging with it, you want more. So the temptation gets worse. You get into darker and darker content. Can you just tell us a little bit about the impact that that can have on someone as their addiction to pornography starts to spiral out of control?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair thing to say, as you've alluded to, that not everybody who consumes pornography goes on to become addicted to pornography. And I think that's the same argument as we might have with drugs and alcohol and other things. But those people who have a vulnerability of some kind, whether that is that they are using pornography to regulate their emotions, they're dealing with hard emotions by using this external process. Maybe they have trauma in their childhood or abuse or some of those things, or because of the way the internet changed things, they've been exposed to pornography at a much younger age and kind of built this neurological dependence on this process that, we're seeing that escalation. And one of the hallmarks of addiction is the process of tolerance and escalation. So just like you would see with maybe a drug addict who would need to diversify the kinds of drugs they were using or the methods for using drugs that they were engaged with, we see the same thing with pornography, that I need to do more of it. I need to do it more often or for a longer period of time. And so maybe I go from once a week to 3 times a week to 5 times a week to every day to multiple times per day. So you see escalation within frequency and you see escalation within type. And a lot of the people that work with us, by the time they come to us, have escalated in both of those ways. And they're looking at material that when they started viewing pornography, they would never have considered. And that brings a significant amount of moral conflict and shame. And they're often deeply kind of entrenched in that. And of course, in the very worst cases, and this has been a rising issue alongside pornography addiction, in the very worst cases, that escalation can include crossing over into illegal behaviors. And that is something we've also seen kind of rise. And the line between those two types of behavior has become more blurry through the years as a natural result of that process.
Can we talk a little bit then about those that find themselves at that point that you've just talked about, where they've realized that they've begun to engage with content on that blurry line of legality?
Yeah.
What's the shame like for somebody that has to come to you and confess that they've been watching stuff that they shouldn't have been watching?
Yeah, the shame is crippling and debilitating and paralyzing and isolating, because I mean, obviously, we live in a culture where there are very strong feelings around illegal sexual behavior, and understandably so. And so, if you find yourself pulled into a situation like that, it's very easy to believe that you'll be cast out, that people won't want to support you, and actually, there are high suicide risks for that population who have escalated to that point because they can't see a way out where healing and recovery could be possible. And so that shame is no joke. I think there is shame throughout the entire process, particularly for people who hold, and this would be true for Christians, who hold a stronger moral compass around sexually explicit material. Christians tend to feel that moral conflict much sooner than people who don't have that same belief system. And so actually, it doesn't even have to get as far as we're talking about now for Christian people to feel like, who would I even tell about this, and how could I possibly expect to be accepted and loved through this?
I'm glad that you've mentioned Christians there, because some people listening to this might not understand that this is something that Christians wrestle with. But I see surveys every now and again that suggest that pornography use is just as prevalent in Christian communities as it is in the secular world. Now, you might be able to correct me if I'm wrong here, but off the top of my head, I think it's something like 1 in 3 men, Christian men, say that they have at least engaged with pornography during the past year. And that's people that admit it. There may be men within it that don't admit it. And I actually heard somebody arguing the other day that said that you should just presume that men are addicted to pornography, or at least that they engage with it in some way. So can you just help us to bust that myth that this isn't something that Christian men struggle with?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Christian people, we want to believe that there is something different to be found in our churches than in other parts of our society. And so it makes sense to me that people want to believe that this is not a problem for Christians. But all of the statistics that I've seen have shown the church on equal footing, and sometimes maybe statistically, quote, worse than other places in our society. And there are lots of reasons that might be true. I mean, the first and most obvious reason is that Christians are people too, and we have all the same susceptibilities that people have. But perhaps we also have an increased sense of that shame because of the moral conflict that we feel, and maybe because we also think we must be the only ones who are doing it, because so many of us think, well, it can't be happening in the pews of my church, right? And so I guess there is a culture of silence and secrecy around this, maybe in an increased way in our churches, and so it is really sad to think that in some ways Christians feel more isolated, when in theory the church is, the context that you would want people to be working through this issue in their Christian community. And so, yeah, I think this is an issue that we hope and pray that the church will educate themselves around, so that actually the church can be the place and the context where people seek to work this stuff out for themselves.
So we've done a really great job so far of highlighting what the problem is, how people can get caught up into difficult spirals. We've talked a little bit about the church and Christians within the church being addicted to pornography. So we've done a good job at diagnosing the problem. I'd like to spend the rest of our conversation, if we can, trying to look at solutions for the way forward, because you mentioned earlier on that there'll be some men out there listening to this, actually not just men, women as well, who feel shame and they don't see a way out. If there's anybody like that listening now who says that their pornography use has become unmanageable, what are the first steps that you'd encourage them to take?
Yeah, I mean, there's something that I kind of would always say in response to that question, which is find somebody to tell. And even as those words come out of my mouth, I acknowledge and recognize the challenge of that for all the reasons that we've just talked about. And so I would suggest that finding someone to tell doesn't necessarily mean you need to find a therapist or an organization like Naked Truth Project, although they might provide a context that feels that kind of almost implicitly safe. But there are people in our churches who can be that safe person for you. And typically the way that we help people to assess that is by thinking about, who do you know that is generally safe and empathetic and compassionate and champions you? And because I think something that people ask me often is, well, what if there's nobody in my church who's also had this struggle? And I'm like, gosh, if we only ever tell our problems to people who've had the exact same problem, then, that we're really narrowing our options. And so we're looking at who are people who might be safe, who are people who generally have proven to be to some extent non-judgmental and empathetic and willing to walk with you, who are people who have championed you, who love you and believe in you, and see if you can find someone to tell. I would say that when we're talking about levels of kind of compulsive or addictive behavior, the likelihood that you can overcome this by yourself is slim to none. Most people have tried that by the time they get to us, and they have realized that there's a saying in recovery circles that the thinking that gets you into a problem isn't usually going to help you get out. And so we often need people around us who can help us, support us, and kind of guide us in that process. And so tell someone, anyone who might be safe, and then allow them to get you into help and support.
There's an interesting side topic that we can talk about here as well, because you mentioned that we think we can get ourselves out of it. Now, we realize as Christians that God can help us get out of it. But I've spoken to several men who've struggled with an addiction to pornography, who have spent hours on their knees asking God to take this away. And for whatever reason, he hasn't done that. So can you talk to us a little bit about the faith aspect of that and how we could perhaps help someone through if they come to us and confess an addiction to pornography?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question, because this is a space where we as a Christian charity see a lot of spiritual crisis, a lot of questions. The people that we work with, as you said, have often spent not just hours, not days, not weeks, but sometimes years in prayer, pleading with God to remove this thorn from their side. And for whatever it's worth, my view on that has become one that kind of understands that this is not just a spiritual problem, and it's not just a moral problem. You know, addiction impacts the way our brains work. It literally changes the neural pathways in the brain. And so there is something very flesh among the spirit of the problem. And so the solution to the problem, therefore, is a hybrid solution, that we have to do the work in the spirit, but we also have to do the work in the flesh. And I have seen God partner beautifully with people in a collaboration for that effort. So I think when you're in an addiction and you are desperately looking for a way out, it's easy to hope and pray for God to just do something and to take it away. But actually the journey of recovery is a journey, and it is a kind of process of understanding yourself and knowing yourself and maybe undoing some lies that you've been believing. And that is a spiritual process of formation, a spiritual process of maturation, growing up. It's an identity process. And I know that God is really interested in that process, but he wants you to come with, he wants you to partner with him in that process. And so, yeah, I think this is very much a spiritual proposition coupled with the practical elements of that. And we try to approach our work from both of those perspectives.
Can we also acknowledge and maybe speak to those listening to this right now who have partners who've been caught up in this? Because I'm imagining, we mentioned shame earlier, I'm imagining there's a lot of shame out there for those who've realised that their partner has been addicted to this kind of stuff. What words of advice would you give them?
Yeah, and it's really, really important that we do acknowledge that, because my entry point into this work is having walked that journey as a partner myself, and really understanding that while there were limited resources available for people struggling, there were even fewer resources available for those in relationships with people who were struggling. And so it's super important that we don't forget the porn widows, as I've heard them sometimes referred to. The impact on partners can be very significant, to the point where a lot of what they experience looks like and feels like post-traumatic stress type symptoms, with intrusive thoughts and, like you said, shame, and lots and lots of anger can come up in that space, because where there has been shame, there will also have been secrecy. There will also have been often deception, that thing we would know as gaslighting nowadays, where there's been some manipulation of that person's reality. No, you didn't see what you saw. No, you didn't. That wasn't what you think it was. And the impact on that on a partner is very destabilizing. There's a lot of spiritual crisis in that place too, for women we mostly work with women who have been married to men with problematic sexual behaviors, and often they're married to men who they really believe that God has chosen and picked out for them. And so that's very fundamentally destabilizing to their relationship with God too. And so I would say the mistake that I see partners making is believing that if they get fixed, if the porn problem gets fixed, then I'll be okay. And of course that's really important and it's part of the picture, but actually the damage that can be left behind by the discovery of secretive and deceptive sexual behavior is significant, and it deserves and demands its own attention. And so we have support services available for partners as well as users.
Some couples that get caught up in this, maybe the partner, you've mentioned that you mostly work with women. So let's say the woman in the relationship who's found out that her husband is addicted to pornography might just say, well, that's it. This relationship isn't worth working on anymore. What would you say into a situation like that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's not our experience. In two ways, actually. Certainly, my experience is that most Christian women are faithful to the vows that they made in marriage, and they are typically, not always, but typically able to view this through a sickness and health kind of a lens, and are there's actually some research that says that overwhelmingly within Christian marriages and non-Christian marriages, women particularly are willing to stay in their relationship if the deception and the betrayal behavior stops. I think it's something like 80+% of women answered that way. But that's the kicker, right? If the behavior stops and if the deception around the behavior stops, most people are able to and willing to look towards a process of recovery and healing within the context of their relationship. It's when those behaviors don't stop, when there's repeated deception, ongoing deception, that becomes a much more difficult proposition for them. I would say we see beautiful stories of restoration in our work every day of the week. I would also say we see many stories where only one person is really committed to doing the work of healing, and they often make the relationship untenable. And that's really sad when that happens.
What do you think healthy, sustainable recovery looks like in this area?
I think healthy, sustainable recovery looks like more than just stopping porn. I think if there was like one lie that was out there in the world that I would love to speak against, it would be the lie that, well, if I just don't look anymore, then I'm probably fixed. And the reason I say that is because I have met many people who have stopped doing the thing, but are living under the same lies or emotional turmoil or brokenness that has led them to the addictive behavior in the first place. And so sometimes we talk about it as if, when you take away the anesthetic, you find out what hurts and then you know what really needs to be healed. And so real recovery looks like stopping the behavior being the starting point, and then the deeper work of how did I get here, and what is it that I'm medicating with this behavior, and what healing am I being invited into now that I'm not using this anesthetic that I've been using. And actually in that place, some really beautiful deep healing work can take place that can lead to not just one whole healthy individual, but a newly refreshed relationship or marriage that is able to achieve deeper levels of intimacy and togetherness than either person has previously experienced. And so, yeah, that's what it looks like to recover. It looks like health and wholeness in all areas of my life.
We've talked in this program about how the digital world has exacerbated the issue of pornography, and since its inception, since we've all got easy access to it, more and more people have struggled with it. But what gives you hope for the digital world? Are there tools out there that we can use? Do you see the digital world being part of the solution here?
Yeah, I mean, we've tried to redeem the digital world in our work as much as we possibly can. And so, right from the very beginning of Naked Truth, we took the principles that made the pornography industry successful, which were that it was affordable, accessible, and anonymous, and we applied them to our work. And so, our Click to Kick program, which is our beginner program for people seeking recovery, was founded in a way that was trying to make it affordable, accessible, and anonymous. And we ran digital groups online. We like to say we were doing Zoom before it got trendy in COVID. And, you know, people who were using their smartphones to access pornography were now using their smartphones to access recovery. And a whole ton of the work that we do is online. And we're trying to kind of reclaim that digital piece. I would say there is a huge amount of hope in the work that we do with young people who really are rethinking their relationship with the digital world and their relationship with pornography. I would summarize our work with young people as they don't know what they don't know until someone invites them to think about it. And very often they are able to say, I didn't know some of this stuff and I don't love that and I don't want to participate in that, which is deeply hopeful for me. And, you know, we sort of think about our work as upstream and downstream. In recovery, we're pulling people out of the river. And in our education work, we're trying to go upstream and stop them from falling in the first place. And there is hope in both of those places. Some people don't get close enough to the river to fall in because they get invited to a new conversation. Other people get dragged out of the river half dead and really recover their entire lives and go on to be, you know, to have amazing lives and very healthy experiences. And so there's hope in all parts of our work.
Just with that comment in mind then, as a final question for you, let's talk to somebody that might be listening to this now, who you mentioned earlier on that some people just pray for years for healing from this and never receive it. What hope can you give them right now from the work that you've done that one day they might be free of this?
Yeah, I think the hope is that I can say with complete conviction that you are not the only one. That's the lie that shame wants us to believe, is that no one else is doing the things we're doing. They're not thinking the things we're thinking. They're not feeling the things that we're feeling. And I know that there are hundreds of men in our groups, hundreds of women in our groups who are thinking, feeling, and doing some of the same things that you have thought, felt, and done. And so, you know, it's a really scary thing to take that first step. But there are people who get it and who don't want to judge you, but want to help you out of the river. And so I would encourage you to take that first step, even though it's hard.
And just very quickly, Kat, you mentioned confessing earlier, and some people might find it easier to confess to someone like your team at the Naked Truth Project who
Absolutely.
They don't know. So if anybody wants to do that and they want to explore options for the way forward, where do they need to go? How can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, they can find us at nakedtruthproject.com. Dead easy. We've got resources on there for people needing help. We've also got loads of resources on there for churches and church leaders, and we have an app for church leaders that I would encourage people to have a look at. Small group leaders, youth leaders, all of that stuff. And so, yeah, nakedtruthproject.com, and you can contact us using the email address that you find there on the website.
Fantastic. Kat Etherington, it's been an absolute pleasure, an eye-opening conversation. Hope it's been useful. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, as we wrap up today's conversation, I hope that you've sensed what I've sensed, that this topic, as heavy and complex as it can feel, is ultimately a conversation that we need to be having. We need to be talking about our longings, our wounds, our habits, and the ways that we try to cope in a world that doesn't always give us space to slow down and reflect. But it's also a conversation about grace, the kind of grace that doesn't ignore the reality of struggle, but meets it with honesty and the possibility of change. Today, Kat has reminded us that pornography addiction isn't just a behaviour to manage. It's often a signal of deeper needs that have gone unmet for too long. And when we begin to understand those needs, when we bring them into the light with safe people, with community, and with a sense that we don't have to hide, that's when healing becomes possible. Not overnight, not perfectly, but step by step. If today's episode has stirred something in you, whether it's your own story or the story of someone that you care about, I want to encourage you today. You're not alone. There are people and resources that can walk with you, and there are communities learning how to talk about this with compassion rather than shame. And there is always hope for change, even when it feels distant. A huge thank you to Kat Etherington for sharing her wisdom and experience with us on the programme today. I'll be back at the same time next weekend for another episode of Faith in a Digital World. This podcast is a production of Transworld Radio UK. For more information, go to our website at twr.org.uk.